Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover two topics. The first one is going to be a very long, extensive poll, which was done by IRI, which is the International Republican Institute in Armenia, about all the public issues and major political figures and the direction of the country. And the second one is going to be a general update about developments in the IT sector in Armenia. This poll was actually conducted by the International Republican Institute, which is an arm of the U.S. Republican Party. And let's go over their questions and try to analyze each of them, or many of them. The first one was about the impressions of the governing class in Armenia, essentially asking who they trust. The number one person who's most trusted at only 17% is the prime minister. Number two is the foreign minister, Arad Mirzoyan, at 5%. And the big winner in this group is actually none of the above. So what you really have here is an entire political class that is discredited. And as far as the prime minister himself is concerned, obviously his base has become quite narrow and very small. Obviously, people are willing to look and vote for an alternative if it emerges, even though we really don't see that in the short run. Then we move on to the second question, which is how satisfied people are with the work of the Prime Minister's office, which is 50 to 48. 50 satisfied, 48 not, which is obviously much higher than his personal approval numbers. To put things in perspective, last year these numbers were actually 38 to 61, i.e. 38% approved of his performance and 61 were disapproving of his performance. Then we move on to the direction of the country, of which 50% of voters think the country is moving in the right direction and 39% think that the country is moving in the wrong direction. Last year, these numbers were actually reversed, with more people thinking the country is going in the wrong direction. Now, the best explainer to this about what could actually cause this, given all the catastrophes that we've gone through over the last year, is likely the economy, which is doing far better, and incomes are up dramatically over the last couple of years. And at the end of the day, voters here, as in most other countries, primarily vote their pocketbook. The second thing on this is this question internationally tells you a lot more about the likely result of future elections than the popularity of a particular candidate. So in this case, despite the fact that the approval rating of the prime minister is actually quite low and most people have essentially don't approve of his performance, given the direction of the country, which is the best indicator of how people will vote, his approval numbers actually discount his political strength, which during an election, he will pick up votes from people who actually don't like him, but will vote for him, one, because there's no alternative, or two, they like the direction of the country or the economic situation in it. Now let's move on to a question about institutions, and the one that we really care about was people's impression of the army. According to the polling, armed forces have an approval rating of 64 to 33 as an institution, but frankly, I think these numbers are completely wrong, and the reason we have these numbers is because this poll was essentially conducted by Western pollsters who do not understand the cultural nuances that would give you such an answer. Because in Armenia, if you ask people about the army without differentiating between the leadership and your average soldier, you're going to get numbers that are far more positive than reality, because this is a nation in which the army and soldiers are essentially your son, your nephew, your grandson. So if you ask people what they think of their relatives or people close to them or people they love, they're going to have a very good impression. If they would actually separate these numbers and have a question on leadership, the numbers would be much lower than what this poll indicates. Then we move on to an interesting question in which they ask what's the biggest success of this government in the past 6 months. And at 17%, it's the Western pivot, Armenia moving away from Russia and towards the West. Secondly is the return of the POWs, and what they're referring to is the 32 people that were held since the war in 2000. Obviously, we still have many more POWs and people illegally that are being held in Baku. Then you move on to what is the biggest failure of this government over the last 6 months, and obviously the biggest one at 36% is the ethnic cleansing and genocide in Artsakh. And the second one is the wrong foreign policy or diplomacy conducted by this government. Then we move on to the foreign policy questions, where you're talking about all issues that are beyond our borders. And in foreign policy, the voters were asked which countries pose the greatest threat to Armenia. Number one was Azerbaijan at 86%. Number two was Turkey at 82%. And number three was Russia at 40%. Then, on the positive ledger, how would you evaluate the current state of relations? This is with countries that are friendly to us. And the top three are France at 96%, India at 93%, and the United States at 89%. When you asked them about Armenia's relations with the EU, 87% have a positive view and 10% a negative view. And if you actually compare this to Russia's numbers in 21, 22, in that range, they were almost exactly the reverse. In analyzing this foreign policy section, what we're actually seeing here is essentially a complete collapse of the Russian position in Armenia. And this started with the September 22 illegal invasion of Armenia. And this continued with the ethnic cleansing and genocide in Artsakh last year. And secondly, it's clear that the pivot to the West is actually generally and broadly popular with the Armenian public. In 2 years, Vladimir Putin has managed to take the only country in this region that did not have an instinctive anti-Russian sentiments and has turned it into the most pro-Western country in the region. If this change in attitudes towards Russia eventually leads to us being on the path of joining the European Union, which is well within the possibilities, or further, or even if not that, continuing the Western trajectory, then Putin and his good friend Aliyev, via their criminal and entirely unnecessary, uncalled for actions over the last 2 years, might have actually triggered a set of events which they will both come to regret. The next question we're going to move to is what should the government's focus be for the next 6 months? And these were the four things that were on top. The first one is strengthening the army. The second one is establishing peace. The third one is revising foreign policy strategy. Fourth is ensuring the security of the country and her borders. Obviously, what we're seeing here is strengthening the military is the top issue with voters and securing our borders that go with that. All of this means that what we're really dealing with here overall is a national security electorate that puts national security issues above all others. When you're looking at all of these numbers and these polling results, what we are actually seeing here, we might be seeing sort of an Armenian version of a concept that an American political scientist, Sheldon Wallen, came up with, which was inverted totalitarianism. And he used to describe the US political system in which he said the establishment holds power, not by repressive or coercive measures, but by creating a disempowered, disengaged, and apathetic public. What we could have in Armenia today is that by default, because our political actors are nowhere as sophisticated enough to pull something like that off on their own. Now we're going to move on to the second topic of the week, which is an update on the IT industry in Armenia. First, we're going to start off, we're going to cover both positive and negative trends. First, we're going to start off with the positive, and there's many small things that sort of add up to something that's much bigger. One of the first interesting things was we had a first initial public offering inside of Armenia by Team Telecom, which is a telecommunication and IT firm. And this is actually for the first time in Armenia that you had a local firm that offers stocks that people can buy, and because up to this point, the entirety of the market in Armenia has only been in bonds. In CRISP, which is one of our bright stars and a unicorn in Armenia, actually had its first presentation on the NASDAQ stock exchange, which is the main stock exchange that deals with the IT industry. This is sort of the first initial step among many others that you need to go to start to eventually go public and sell shares on the stock exchange. Armenia itself became the top country in the broader region in terms of attracting foreign venture capital investments. Two Armenia-based venture capital funds, Big Story and Formula VC, were leading the way in investing in promising early-stage startups like Zoomerang and MyThrill. There are many more startups in the Armenian IT scene, and frankly, there's too many of them to actually go over in one show. And what it is clear is that we're actually setting up a very competent and growing ecosystem for people to have startups with their ideas and actually bring them to fruition. In 2023, the number of IT companies registered in Armenia doubled compared to 2022, even though a good part of this were actually driven by Russians, individuals who are actually moving to Armenia and setting up their own companies. We have always had established players like Microsoft, Cisco, VMware, and Synopsys, Adobe operating out of Armenia, but over the last 2 years, we've witnessed a significant surge in major IT companies choosing Armenia as their new home. one of the bigger ones was Yandex, which in March of 23 actually, which is one of the biggest tech giants in Russia, best known for search engines and online services, surprised many people by moving the largest number of employees to Armenia. And Yandex actually plans to have further expansion here, both in software development and product management. And then obviously the biggest prize is NVIDIA, which is the hottest company in the world in the IT sector. It's worth almost $2 trillion. To put this in perspective, that is larger than the entirety of the Russian economy. The company established itself here a couple of years ago. It has a couple of hundred employees, and it's actually growing in leaps and bounds. Now let's move on to the negatives, or what we see as problems ahead. Number one is the level of taxation, because our level of taxation is too high compared to some of our competitors on this front. It's a flat 15% tax on the industry. When lowering it to 5%, where our competitors are at, would actually draw in more people. We actually lost some of the Russian digital nomads to other countries because of this particular reason. The second one, and by far the bigger issue, frankly, is the overvalued drum. The drum has performed against the dollar in ways that are far ahead of other countries. It's one of the strongest, best performing currencies against the dollar, and that's because of the massive amounts of money that's come into the country over the last 2 years, and has actually overvalued the currency by about 20%, to the extent that the state actually had to subsidize the IT industry almost to a quarter, almost in the level of $250 million to actually make up for the money that's lost because of this, the strengthening of the drum. This is good. Obviously, we've had tremendous raise in wages in this sector, but you cannot have wage growth that is about productivity, and since that was not sustainable in the long run. We've actually had layoffs in some of the bigger firms precisely because of this reason, but in all fairness, layoffs in the IT industry were standard around the world. Almost all of these big companies were laying off in most areas outside of AI around the world. In final analysis, I'm actually optimistic about the future of this industry and the impact that's going to have, or the transformative effect it's going to have on our economy. First and foremost, we need to understand that over the last 40 years, 90% of all wealth created in the world has been in the IT sector. So you're either in this business or you actually have no chance of ever becoming a wealthy country. The reason for my optimism are actually twofold. The first one is this is the one area in which the Armenian diaspora has been critical, because almost all the initial doors that were opened into this world were done by the Armenian diaspora. In some ways, the Armenian IT diaspora has done more for this country than all the rest of it put together. Our startups in Armenia, because of this diaspora reach, have much longer reach and much easier way to get into the right places than the startup scenes of other countries. But the second one, I think this is the more important one, is a cultural fit, because when you really look at it and look at the map, there's actually no reason why Armenia should be overperforming on this front. But I think there are specific cultural reasons, and there's the IT subculture is very individualistic, it's disdainful of authority, it's disruptive by nature, and quite entrepreneurial. And frankly, those are all the four corners of our national character. The reality is that some of the same factors that make state building so difficult in Armenia are exactly the same reasons why our country will always overperform on this, what is the most important industry in the world. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.